Shalom, Baruchim Abayim, and welcome to Sheve'im Panim LaTorah, to 70 Faces of the Torah, and also Sulam Yaakov. This week's Torah portion is Parashat Vayiqra. Now, in English, we refer to this as the book of Leviticus. However, we refer to Leviticus in Hebrew as Vayiqra. And obviously, the English is a reference to the Latin Vulgate translation of the Torah, or what they call in Greek, the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses. And it's a reference, obviously, to the Levitical tribe of Levi. And so it deals with all the Levitical or priestly administration of the Mishkan, and eventually later what we know as the Beit HaMikdash, the temple system. However, when we take a look at the name in Hebrew, Vayiqra, it has a completely different connotation. For one, Vayiqra means to be called. And in fact, the way the Torah begins is Vayiqra el-Moshe, which we translate that, and he, assuming God, called to Moshe, even though it does not say that God called to Moshe, which we'll get into that in just a brief second. And so we see here that the entire Chumash of Vayiqra, since we're now in a new Chumash of the Torah, we just concluded with the Chumash of Shemot, or the book of Exodus, which in Hebrew, as I referred to before, is the book of names, in which we see different titles of HaKadosh Baruch Hu are used throughout the whole Yitziyat, the exiting process of the Jews from Mitzrayim. And so now we transfer over to Vayiqra, which deals with the calling of God, learning to listen to the voice of Hashem, which is why I have subtitled this teaching, Discerning the Voice of God. Now, the Chumash of Vayiqra, it contains such wonderful, great depths, insight, chidushim, insights, etc., that there's so many different topics to talk about. For one, we do know that this Torah portion is the introduction to what we call the korbanot, or the temple system that many people understand as the sacrifices. A lot of people believe that they are obviously archaic, something outdated. However, I explained in many teachings, and I will address this in further teachings as well, that the korbanot were essentially introduced due to the Chet HaEgel, the sin of the golden calf, the concept of building God a dwelling place back in Parashat Truma in Exodus 25:8, V'yasu le'mikdash v'shachanti betocham, was never based on a physical edifice. This is why we see that after the sin of the golden calf, in Parashat Kitasa, Parashat Vayiqra, and Parashat Pikudei, we read a lot of the redundancies from Parashat Truma and Parashat Tetzaveh being mentioned. And the reason why is because due to the sin of the golden calf, the introduction of korbanot essentially would serve as a microcosm to the deeper meaning of creating God a dwelling place, which was inside of man. And so if you took a look at my teachings on the different aspects of the Mishkan and the Kelim, the vessels, I explained in those teachings in great detail how certain vessels served as a microcosm of man. And so man essentially is a microcosm of the universe. So Parashat Vayiqra and the other Parshiyot, or Sidrot as we should say, of the book of Leviticus also build on top of that with the korbanot. And the korbanot system is a very intricate system that a lot of people do not have a great and I would say deep appreciation for. In the Jewish world today, we do, most people don't know, but the majority of the prayers, okay, that we say from the Siddur, a good percentage of the rules, the laws that were developed and how we daven are derived strictly from the korbanot system, which is why if you ever daven shacharit at the earliest point of their morning hours, going to what's called aliyot hashachar, the earliest point of dawn, and you take your time in your siddur, whether you daven Nusach Ashkenaz or Sephardic, you notice that there's the incorporation of Mishnayot, passages of the Mishnah that deal with certain parts of the shacharit korbanot, as they were done in the temple in the Mishkan. Okay, you read about the incense offering, the korban olah, which is the korban tamid, the twice offerings that were done in the morning and also later at mincha, the afternoon sessions. And so we recite those over in the Mishnah. And then eventually you begin the public davening with the Shalach Sibor or whoever's leading the prayer. If one prays individually, they go through the respective prayers. But basically we incorporate the korbanot into our prayers, because on a microcosmic level, we are in a way a korban chai, a living sacrifice before HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So for one to truly delve into the system of the korbanot, they develop a deep appreciation of understanding. We're not just looking at some archaic, ancient form of religion that the quote-unquote Israelites practiced thousands of years ago, okay, but it deals with the inner meaning. Yes, there was an external form of sacrifices, okay. In Hebrew, we don't even call it sacrifices. A korban literally is from the three-letter root karav, which means to draw near. Zevach, slaughtering, which you could translate as sacrifice, is the root of the word mizbeach, altar, as where one would negate their ego that eventually caused a transgression between them and Hashem, which is ultimately what the Yehezqel did. And there's so much detail, deep appreciation, because when you look at the different offerings the Torah introduces in Parashat Vayiqra, I mean the korban olah, the korban chatat, the korban asham, the korban talui, these different korbanot, or aspects of drawing near to Hashem, would rectify certain damages. I mean, the fact that a korban olah we translate as a burnt offering in some Bibles, or a better term is an elevation offering. Nobody participated in receiving that korban olah, not the kohanim, not the individual who brought it. And when you take a look at what each offering was to rectify for, the korban olahs, the sages tell us, was for hirichor halev, which we translated as contemplations of the heart. And it's interesting when you peel apart the Hebrew, which I won't get in full detail right now because that's not a part of the topic for today, but it deals with the elevation of one's thoughts. In other words, rectifying one's thoughts, which is very, very deep, because I will touch base on that concept towards the end of this teaching. And so when you go through the korbanot, and I have a separate teaching I'll have uploaded as well, dealing with that when I'm talking about here. I mean, there's the whole concept of how the Kohen would receive the blood, the 4 different halachot procedure of the slaughtering process, receiving the blood, tossing it on the outer altar. And depending on the korban that a person brought, whether it was a chatat, asham, olah, etc., would determine where exactly the Kohen would place the blood. Was at the top part of the altar, the bottom part of the altar. The altar was divided into 2 partitions, if you will, and the Kohen would not communicate verbally with the individual bringing the korban, rather through his silence of his avodah, of his movement, would relay a message. You can almost say like telepathic in a way, a message, like a telepathy of some sorts to the consciousness of the individual. And at the same time, at least when the Beit HaMikdash stood, the door to the Yehezqel was open, and they would see what's inside the parochet that separated the Holy of Holies, and they would see in front of them the menorah, the lechem, the shochan lechem panim, the bread of faces, the altar of golden incense. They would see all these things in conjunction with the Kohen's movement, and it would convey a very deep message upon their conscience. Not only that, they would hear the Levites worshiping Hashem with various songs that we know it would be later the Psalms and things of that nature. So it's a very, very in-depth experience that when one takes the time out to study in detail, they will learn that even though you don't have a physical Beit HaMikdash, physical avodah in this aspect of slaughtering korbanot, it doesn't mean that the laws pertaining to those things are irrelevant, or they're outdated, or as Christianity has taught, they have been replaced or done away with. Chasas chalila. They definitely have not. And they still have a rightful place today when you understand them in the development of the Siddur, how you daven, and many other things as well. So with that said, let us digress to the topic at hand, which I have called this teaching, Discerning the Voice of God. And I think it's a pretty interesting subtitle, considering that a lot of people try to discern what's happening in life, especially not just on an individual level, but there's a collective desire to understand the times that people live in, especially with the uncertainty that we are all experiencing in the world today that has actually been going on for the past couple years. So nonetheless, as we turn to the Torah portion, the Sidra of Vayiqra, we notice here some unique expressions being used and some anomalies right off the bat. We see here the Torah begins in Vayiqra, Leviticus 1 through 2. Vayiqra el-Moshe v'daber Adonai elav. It says Moshe was called. Now, some translations will say, and he was called, and he called Moshe, meaning that he refers to Hashem. However, you do not see the word he actually in the Hebrew. And by the way, he is who, and who is he? Well, he is she in Hebrew. Okay, not to get anyone confused, but if you refer to a female in Hebrew, like you're saying, oh, that's her over there, that's the term is he, but if you're referring to a male, then it's who, okay? So we don't see that here, just as Vayiqra, and it says, and Moshe was called. There's a conjunctive vav there, and Moshe was called towards Moshe. Vaydaber Adonai. And now it says, and Hashem spoke elav. To him, me'ohel, prefix mem, meaning from the tent of meeting. And it says afterwards, more saying, Daber el b'nei Israel, speak to the children of Israel, ve'amarta lehem, and say to them. It says, Adam ki yari michem charben la'Adonai, min ha'behema, min ha'bakar, u'min ha'tzon, tachlivu et karbanechem. In order for a man to draw near. Now, this is my translation. It's going to differ from other translations, but this is a more accurate translation. For a man to draw near, remember, korban is karav. Now, I don't explain all the etymology in this teaching, but I will in a separate teaching. To Hashem, he must offer, or literally draw from within. Mikem, okay, is the term there I don't have highlighted in yellow. Mikem karban, must draw forth from within to Hashem, la Adonai, to God. And it says three different categories of drawing near. Men habehema, from the animal. And by the way, all this is in the singular, not the plural. Men habakar, which is from the stock of cattle. Men hason, from the flock, which is sheep or goats. And therefore, tachrivu et karbanechem. There's a repetition, a karav here. This is the method of how that person should draw near. And once again, B'ezras Hashem, I'll get into that in a separate teaching to break this down. It's very, very informative. But we see here that the Torah, it does not say, and which one would think it would say, it does not say, Vayiqra Adonai el-Moshe. It doesn't impose the title Hashem here. God is not in the middle here. It's not God calling. The Torah says, Vayiqra el-Moshe. And Moshe was called. Interesting. Now you also notice the letter Aleph is small, and that's actually how it appears in the Sefer Torah. This is another one of the grammatical anomalies we find preserved by the scribes, the Sofrim, and there's a unique insight to that, is that one is that Moshe, because he was such a humble individual, he considered himself as not worthy. And because he was a humble individual invested in what we call bitul hayesh, negation of oneself, therefore, he was an individual receptive to be able to communicate with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is something that we'll be dealing with in this teaching. And so Moshe was being called here, right? It doesn't just say God called him, because everyone has a subjective interpretation, like if God would speak to me, if I could hear from God, right? There's all these other fictitious fantasies that people think of what God sounds like. Nobody knows. Okay, it's a unique mystery. So one of the things that we see right from the start of this Torah portion is that one of the prerequisites of being called by Hashem is the ability to recognize that everything in life is a message from Hashem. I'm going to say that again. A prerequisite to being called by Hashem is the ability to recognize that everything in life is a message from Hashem. That includes not just the good things, but also the bad things. And so many of the messages that Hashem send us, they're not audible. They're not captured in words. Rather, the messages that Hashem send us, they are encryptic and can only be deciphered from within the depths of our soul. This is very powerful. Now, in cryptography, encryption is the process of encoding a message or information in such a way that only authorized individuals can access it. And those who are not authorized, well, guess what? They cannot access that information. They're locked out the system. And sadly, this is the majority of humanity that recognize and believe in the Creator in their respective religious beliefs. They all have their different perception of how they hear from God, right? But how many truly hear from Him? That's obviously, there's a litmus to that, because we go by the Torah. We have a clear system, a Masorah translated, that if a Navi rises up, one claims they're a prophet, and obviously that message contradicts the Torah. Well, that person's not a Navi, they're a Navi Sheker, they're a false prophet, etc. Right? God communicates differently with different people, and it all depends upon how they refine themselves, which is something I'll get to at the end via a Rambam. And this is important because God speaks to everyone differently. Yes, he can speak in dreams. Dreams are not always literal. They can be metaphorical, allegories. He can speak in nature. Okay, so one can almost appear like they're a native Indian, interpreting nature of some sorts via whether it's, it could be many things. I mean, a shooting star, a comet, it could be through a raccoon, who knows? It's all subjective, okay? Relative to that individual and how God communicates with them. But for a person to discern that, they also have to be spiritually mature. Now later in the Torah portion, when the Torah introduces the Korban Chet, which we translate as the sin offering, it mentions a unique scenario in which a person failed to give credible testimony to something they had witnessed. And in the event that a person, let's say, possessed knowledge that they had witnessed, they perceived evidence, and they failed to transmit this information to the Beit Din, the Torah comes along and charges that individual with violating the mitzvah of bearing false witness, a command that was uttered by Hashem on Har Sinai back in Exodus 20:13. And because this individual was charged with bearing false witness, they were then required to bring a Korban Chet, an inadvertent sin, which by the way is not advertent, but inadvertent sin, a korban, to rectify the damage that they had caused. So we go here to Vayiqra Leviticus chapter 5, which is towards the end of the Torah portion. And it says, "V'nefesh ki techeta v'sham'a kol alav v'chu eid o ra'o yada." If a person will sin, and the language here is very interesting in the Torah, if he accepted a demand for an oath, and he is a witness, and here the Torah says, either he saw or he knew, o ra'o yada. Im lo, the Torah says, yagi v'nasa a'uno. If he does not testify, then it says he shall bear or carry his iniquity. Very interesting jargon that the Hebrew uses, and we'll get back to this in a minute. The Midrash comes along and explains that the root of offering a Korban Chet was to atone for being false witness, right? But the root of that, bearing false witness, goes back to the Chet HaEgel, that Israel bore false witness against Hashem once they got into the whole debacle. And we see here in Vayiqra 6:1, Zesha Mar HaChatuv, we see that it's written here in Proverbs chapter 24:28, that you shall atihe eid chinam bere'echa. You shall not offer a vain or false testimony against your chaver, or against your re'echa, your fellow, if you will. Chaver is a friend, re'echa is like your neighbor per se. Rather, this refers, al tihe eid china, elu Israel. This refers to Israel, because we read in Isaiah 43:12, ve'atem adei neum Adonai. You are my witnesses. This is God speaking to the Jewish people via the prophet Isaiah, okay? And therefore, I am God. And this Shnei Amar, afterwards, we read, va'ani el be'chazeh ha'chadosh baruch hu, and therefore the Holy One, blessed be He, is Israel's friend. And we see that it is not stated not that you should not forsake one's friend. As it says in Proverbs 27:10, do not forsake your friend, and also the friend of your father. So it's interesting, the Midrash here, it looks at the root of bearing false witness to the tragic sin of the Chet HaEgel, that Israel bore false witness against Hashem. And it's fascinating when you look at this command of what the Korban Chatat, the Korban Chet, the sin offering, is required on bearing false witness. There's a unique halakha behind this. It's very profound. The purpose of the Jewish nation on a collective and individual level is to bear witness to Hashem. to stand before the world as a living testimony to his greatness and sovereignty. This is accomplished by one's conduct. One's conduct is measured by their observance of the mitzvot. And so when we tread the path of Torah and mitzvot, when we conduct ourselves in a righteous manner in both thought and deed, we are reflecting God's perfect and righteous ways, which ultimately sanctifies his great name. Now, our testimony to Hashem is not based upon words alone, okay? But it's based upon our actions. Actions speak louder than words. And so we bear witness through the way we live our lives. And much like a witness in court, our testimony must remain uncorrupted without an ulterior motive. Just as a witness in court may not accept any type of what the Torah calls a shochet, a bribe, a financial advancement of anything to alter their testimony. Likewise, we must serve Hashem lishma for its own sake, for the sake of God. That means we are not permitted to alter our lives for the sake of achieving some type of little success in this world. The witness who alters his testimony to obtain a form of comfortability, luxury, or whatever, is flawed, and that means that person's witness cannot be trusted. Likewise, when we compromise the mitzvot to meet the standards of a preferred way of living in this world, we bear false witness to Hashem and his Torah. The Torah says that the one who fails to testify what he saw or knows will have to carry his own transgression. And this is unique because there is a redundancy here in the text, which I'm going to go back to. We see here the phrase, Ra'a o yada. Either he saw or he knew. Why is the redundancy? I mean, you see something, you obtain information from what you're watching, what you're perceiving, right? You know something. So it's kind of redundant. Why does the Torah use this redundant phrase? What's up with that? And then it comes along and says, Im lo yagiv v'nasa aono. And that means that this individual is going to have to carry his own aono, his own iniquity, his own transgression. Now, we also find another spelling anomaly in here, and that's actually with the word lo, im lo, which is interesting because the word lo here could have been written in its usual abbreviated form, which is lamed aleph, which in Hebrew simply means no. That's all it means. Instead, it's written in its expanded form. It's spelled lamed vav aleph. Okay, you have the letter vav added between lamed and aleph. Now, the word lo on the far right of the screen, without the aleph, it literally means for him. And so this is unique because the Torah is teaching us something unique here. This teaches us that the end of the verse here in Leviticus 5:1 carries a dual meaning. One, you could read it as im lo, okay, meaning that it is for him. That if he saw o yada and knew something im lo for himself, yagid v'nasa aono, and did not act upon that, then he's going to be responsible to carry his own iniquity, okay? Or we can read it as imlo, as lamed aleph, that if he doesn't say anything, okay, like, no, he's just going to be silent, put me in witness protection, I don't know nothing, I plead the fifth, well, then he's also going to have to bear the repercussions of bearing witness to a transgression of some sort that he's going to have to carry. So, and he may have been motivated by altering his testimony, right? So at the end, he's going to have the consequence. So it's interesting that you could read this two ways. One, it's for him, and one, it's going to go against him. I mean, what is the Torah trying to teach us here? There's an actual inner meaning here. So prior to giving their testimony, a witness underwent very rigorous scrutiny to determine if there was any inconsistencies or falsehoods, all right? And so it's almost like if you ever fly El Al, right? And you choose to get interrogated by, who knows, some of the Mossad agents, whoever on the flight, the air marshals. It could be a very rigorous thing because you get cross-examined by like 10 or 15 different people. It's happened to me a few times. Hey, whatever. And then eventually they realize, okay, the guy's fine, right? We don't find any deceit in him. That's how it is. This is how things are supposed to work in Jewish law, all right? This same principle is supposed to apply to our day-to-day lives. What do I mean? Well, it's not enough for a person to simply claim they believe in Hashem, they live by the mitzvot. No, it's not enough for just lip service. The true test comes when one's service to Hashem is faced with difficulties and temptations. If one endures the test, because that's the root of a testimony, right? Your testimony is only legit if you're able to pass the test, if you're able to remain faithful, if you have sanctified the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then you are ne'eman, then you're considered a faithful witness. In Jewish law, ordinary testimony is only valid if it's susceptible to a process of falsification in Hebrew that is known as hazama. This is interesting. Hazama deals with areas of a witness testimony in which the witness is accused by others of having imanu haitem, having been with them at a certain location where there was a certain ungodly activity going on, a certain crime maybe. If hazama is not a part of the witness testimony, meaning if the witness failed to state where the incident took place, then the testimony is invalid. It's an interesting way of how this works in the court. When we look at hazama on a spiritual level, we learn something very unique. What is that? Our testimony to Hashem is only valid if it can be challenged. If somebody wishes to separate themselves from involvement in, let's say, the mundane activities of the secular world, they want to become a recluse, a monk of some sorts, and live in the caves, in the mountains, or in the wooded forest, isolated from the temptations of the secular world, and one may be looked upon as possessing this beautiful religious aesthetic. Oh, wow, this person is like a monk. They hum with the birds and they radiate with the sun rays at the rising of the sun and the whole, spring and winter equinoxes. They are out there covered inside of leaves and snow, right? Undergoing this form of discipline. Well, that person's testimony of being a quote-unquote believer in God is invalid. Doesn't matter how holy they appear. Doesn't matter how well the sun resonates with them on a magnetic level when they're humming or whatever the heck they're doing out there in the woods, right? Maybe some type of beauty to it. But no matter how holy they appear, their life is an invalid testimony to God. Why? Because they have removed themselves from the arena of life from being tested. See, in Judaism, man was designed to be put right into the gashmiut, right into the midst of chaos, okay? To learn to find balance, not to be on one extreme or the other. And so for you and me to fulfill our purpose, we must live in the real world that is subject to difficulties and great temptations. That means there must be times in our life when we have faltered, when we have stumbled, right? And there's areas where the Yetzer Hara goes before Hashem in the heavenly court, and they say, who he or she, Hayati, was with me. On that night, at this time, they were with me. They were ready to give in, just like Yosef with the Eshet Potiphar, with Potiphar's wife, about to give in to sexual temptation. They weren't with you, Hashem, they were with me. They were in a place of sin, in a place of spiritual crime. Now, unbeknownst to many people, it is this type of possibility that validates one's testimony. How does this validate a person's testimony? Well, if we can resist the temptation of the Yetzer Hara, if we can deny the power of our natural inclination to move away from God, okay, to move away from His Torah, then we emerge victorious and we stand as a faithful witness to God's Torah. Now, I pointed out earlier that there is a redundancy in the verse when it speaks about a person having knowledge of a certain transgression but failed to present that knowledge to the Beit Din, which makes them guilty of bearing false witness. We'll go back to the passage here in Vayiqra 5:1. ונפש כי תחתה ושמעה קול עליו והוא עד או ראה או ידע, אם לא יגיב ונעשה העונו. If a person would sin, if he accepted a demand for an oath, he's a witness, either he saw or he knew. It's redundant. What do you mean he saw or he knew? Isn't it the same thing? In Masechet Shavuot, Chazal explained the reason why somebody would be chayev or liable for bearing false witness, is because they saw something. They knew something was true, but they did not act upon it. Now, from the Peshat, the basic approach of interpretation, we would assume that if somebody saw something and failed to testify or convey that truth, then they should be held liable, but it's actually much deeper than that. The Midrash explained that if we encountered somebody committing a transgression, we bore witness to that transgression. Ra'a o yada, we saw it privately. The Midrash says that we are chayev. We are actually liable of the transgression we witness another person committing. Now remember, I broke this down earlier with the anomaly of the spelling lo in its expanded form, lamed vav aleph. If it's just lamed vav, it's for him, right? Lamed aleph is no, right? Something is for him. So in a way, the Midrash is conveying that a person is saw, they have knowledge of something intimately private that they saw another person do, and it's for that person who ra'ah, they saw it. And so the Midrash is saying that the individual who witnessed someone else commit the transgression, then that person who saw it is guilty of that very transgression. Now hold on a second. How can somebody be liable, okay, of a sin they witnessed somebody else commit when they themselves didn't do it? What the heck? That doesn't make sense. Now we get to the inner meaning of this verse. Okay? What does that mean? I mean, does the Midrash say you saw it, you didn't actually you call up and report the crime, so you're chayev? Okay, I get it. You can almost be considered accessory to the crime then, right? But you mean you're telling me I'm just as guilty of Aleph Beit Gimel crime that I saw a person commit, I didn't physically commit? How can I be chayev for something I didn't do, but I saw somebody else do? So how do we answer this? So I'd like to digress to a story to draw out the answer. And there's a story of el-Moshe, David of Chokava, who was getting ready to usher in the Shabbat. And as el-Moshe was preparing for the Kiddush, the Kabbalah Shabbat, sanctifying the Sabbath, comes along this Chiluni, this secular Jew who walks in off the street. Now, this Chiluni, he had no interest in serving Hashem. He's just schlepping through the town. And he was always interested to see how Hasidic Jews observe Shabbat. And so, as this Chiluni entered into the building, he moved to the front, okay, to be able to witness the rabbi usher in the Shabbat. He wanted to see all the rich symbolism and the nigunim, the chanting they did, etc. And as el-Moshe was getting ready to usher in Shabbat, he closed his eyes, he's chanting a nigun, and as he lifts up the cup, the Kiddush cup, he's getting ready to say the blessing. And he opened his eyes slightly, looking at the fire for the Shabbat candles. And as his sight gazed over to the face of his disciples, suddenly he noticed the face of this Chiluni, the secular Jew. And immediately el-Moshe noticed that this Chiluni was in the middle of violating Shabbat because he was schlepping around a stick. And at that location, they did not have an Eruv, a Shabbat Techum fully established. And carrying something like a stick is a violation of Torah law, biblical law. And so upon seeing this Chiloni, el-Moshe immediately put down the Kiddush cup and ran to an adjacent room for about 30 minutes in seclusion. And so after 30 minutes passed, el-Moshe returned. He noticed the Chiloni is gone. And from there, he gathered all his disciples to finish making the Kiddush. Well, concerned by their rabbi's behavior, all the disciples approached Rabbi Moshe and they said, "Hey, Makara, what happened? Why'd you do that?" And so Rabbi Moshe wanted to answer their question by delineating to a story that he knew about the Baal Shem Tov. And so he told his disciples that there was a certain occasion in which the Baal Shem Tov was hosting Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Polony. And Rabbi Yaakov Yosef, at that time, he sought out the Baal Shem Tov in order to learn about some of the secrets of the Torah. And so on one particular day, as these two men of God were engaged in very deep mystical concepts of the Torah, there was a sudden knock on the door. And the Baal Shem Tov didn't really want to be disturbed, but he gets up, he answers the door, and who is it? It's the local non-Jew who made his living by collecting scrap metal and fixing little miscellaneous items. Well, not wanting to be disturbed from their mystical dialogue, the Baal Shem Tov informed the non-Jew he had no scrap metal and nothing needed to be fixed. As he's saying, Zaykazut, be well, he's getting ready to close the door, and the non-Jew puts his hand in the door and he yells out to the Baal Shem Tov and he says, Rabbi, there's always something that needs to be fixed. Just take a look for me. Feeling frustrated, the Baal Shem Tov agreed to take a look around his home to see if there was something that the non-Jew could fix. Well, after searching his home for about 15 to 20 minutes, the Baal Shem Tov found a small pocket watch that was not working. And as the Baal Shem Tov gave the pocket watch to the non-Jew said, see, Rabbi, there's always something that needs to be fixed. And as the Baal Shem Tov returned to the table to continue speaking with Rabbi Yaakov Yosef, Rabbi Yaakov Yosef was upset that the Baal Shem Tov would just abandon him to satisfy the parnosa of this non-Jew. Well, after hearing Rabbi Yaakov Yosef's complaint, the Baal Shem Tov then informed Rabbi Yaakov Yosef that non-Jew did not show up at my door by accident. Rather, he was sent by Hashem. Completely baffled by the Baal Shem Tov's statement, Rabbi Yaakov Yosef says, how? And the Baal Shem Tov then informed Rabbi Yaakov Yosef that prior to that non-Jew showing up at his house, these two individuals, they were engaged in very lofty spiritual concepts that are reserved only for the spiritually mature. And it's a very dangerous thing for people to fall in love with certain spiritual concepts or knowledge without living a lifestyle that identifies with those concepts. In other words, approaching certain mystical concepts of the Torah from, let's say, a purely academic perspective is a sin. And so the Baal Shem Tov told Rav Yaakov Yosef, the message that Hashem was conveying through the non-Jew was that in order to be worthy of these deep insights of the Torah, you first need to fix some things. The Baal Shem Tov's rush to dismiss the non-Jew was symbolic of his ego to basically try to brush things aside, to indulge in this knowledge that they were sitting down learning with each other. And so the Baal Shem Tov told Rabbi Yaakov Yosef, before we are worthy of deeper truths, we must first search inside to see if there's anything that needs to be fixed. And so that 20 minutes of searching for a small pocket watch was symbolic of doing a cheshbon hanefesh, a soul searching, if you will, a inner inventory of the soul. And so after Rabbi Moshe told his disciples the story of the Baal Shem Tov, he said that when the Chiluni entered into the building and was standing before him, and he was schlepping around the stick, which is a violation of Shabbat, Rabbi Moshe said he knew that before he could say the blessing to sanctify the Shabbat, he needed to go seclude himself to see if there was any part of him that was in violation of God's Torah. And so after performing a cheshbon hanefesh, Rabbi Moshe said that when he returned and saw that Chiloni was gone, he knew that it was a message that Hashem was pleased with him, and now he could finally usher in the Shabbat, sanctifying God's name. And so what we learn from this is that everything in life is a message from Hashem. Everything. Chazal tell us that every single day, the voice of God goes forth from Mount Sinai. Every day. We read here in the Mishnah of Pirkei Avot 6:2, it says, B'chol yom vayom ba'kol yotzeit mehar choref. Every day a heavenly voice goes out from Mount Horeb, which is another name for Mount Sinai. Umachrazet ve'omeret oy lahem labiriyot me'obona shel Torah. And it says, woe to the creatures, human beings, creation, for weakening the Torah. When Chazal says, B'chol yom vayom b'chol yotzet mehar chorev, it is indicative of the Torah that we have before us. When we fail to apply the mitzvot of the Torah and our challenges, our trials, our tribulations, we are weakening God's power. This is why the end of the Mishnah says, Oy lahem labiriyut me'elbona shel Torah. Woe to man, woe to the creation of God for weakening the Torah. When we fail, to apply the mitzvot, we are weakening God's power in this world. And because we fail to discern the voice of God in our trials and tribulations, we invalidate our testimony. We are not being faithful. Actions speak louder than words. Now, in the beginning of this week's Torah portion, as I explained at the beginning, we read the words of Vayiqra el-Moshe. And Moshe was called. It doesn't say Vayiqra HaShem el-Moshe. We know obviously it's God calling Moshe, but on a different level. There's a communication process taking place that only Moshe is able to perceive. He's on that frequency with God. And now it's taking place from the Ohel Moed, the tent of meeting. This is interesting, because according to the Torah, nobody else heard the voice of God except Moshe. I mean, how is this possible? Now, there's only 2 times in the Torah that the phrase Vayiqra el-Moshe appears. Once in this week's Torah portion, and back in Parashat Mishpatim, right where Hashem spoke from Har Sinai. We go back here to Exodus chapter 24, verse 16. Vayishkon kevod Adonai al Har Sinai, the glory of Hashem rested upon Mount Sinai. And it says the cloud covered it for a Sheshet Yamim, a 6-day period, Vayiqra el-Moshe. And Moshe was called. By Yom HaShvi'i, on the 7th day, meaning Shabbat, mitoch he'enan, and he entered into the mist, into the middle of the cloud. Interesting. We discover both in Parashat Mishpatim and also in this week's Torah portion that before God speaks to Moshe, before there's a Vayidaber Adonai el-Moshe, a phrase that appears redundantly through the Sefer Torah, there is a Vayiqra el-Moshe. There is a calling that must take place first. Back in Parashat Yisroel, the Torah says that when Israel heard the voice of God, they were in fear of their life. And they pleaded with Moshe to act on their behalf. We go back to Exodus 20, verse 16, verse 19, depending on other Bibles. Vayomeru Moshe, they said to Moses, Daber ata imanu v'nishma'a. You speak to us and we'll listen to you. V'yidaber imanu elokim pen namut. Why? Because if God speaks, dude, we're going to drop dead. We're going to die. Now let's think about this. How is it that when God spoke on Har Sinai, everybody heard the voice of God? Everyone. But when it comes to Parashat Vayiqra, only Moshe hears the voice of God? How's that possible? And what does it mean that if we continue hearing the voice of God, we're going to die? What do you mean you're going to die? What does that mean? Over in Sefer Tehillim, David HaMelech many times captures key events that took place in the Torah. A soundtrack to the Torah is like what I like to refer to Psalms as. And in many passages, he talks about the greatness of God. And when you go to chapter 29 of Sefer Tehillim, we see there that David recalls the glorious voice of God that thundered in the wilderness, the very voice that the Jewish people are begging Moshe to avoid listening to. We turn here to Tehillim Psalm 29, 3-5. David says, Kol Adonai el hamayim, the voice of Hashem is upon the waters. El hakavod ireim Adonai el mayim rabim, the God of glory thunders. Hashem is upon the vast waters. Ko Adonai b'koach, ko Adonai b'hadar. The voice of Hashem comes in koach, in power. The voice of Hashem comes in beauty and majesty. Ko Adonai shover arazim. This is powerful. The voice of Hashem shatters the arazim, the cedars. Vayishaber Adonai el arazei halevanun. Not only do they shatter the cedars, but the voice of Hashem shatters the cedars of Lebanon, which is the thick wood that Shlomo HaMelech used to construct the first temple with. Now let's think about this for a minute. How can the Kol Adonai, the voice of God, that shatters trees and dissolves brick, not be heard? I mean, David is not simply using poetry to speak about God's voice. David HaMelech is recalling the Kol Adonai, the same Kol Adonai that echoed in the wilderness from Har Sinai. Okay? That's not something that goes undetected. God's voice, according to the Torah, is booming throughout creation, even this very second. So, if God's voice is booming through creation, why don't we hear it then? It's not like he's whispering. It's not like you need the miracle ear to listen to it. So why is it that we can't hear God's voice? And why is it when people are in dilemmas and tribulations, they're looking for God everywhere under a rock, they're trying to find him, but they can't discern him? So what's going on? Many of us are familiar with the story in the Tanakh of Eliyahu, right? When there was a drought happening and Eliyahu goes up to Har Carmel, to the Mount Carmel, which is in the Haifa region of Israel. And he sticks his head between his legs. He's on the floor, prostrating himself. And there's the kol demama daka, the still small voice that Eliyahu hears. It's in 1 Kings 19:12. And we see that in a whole episode, Eliyahu finally hears God's voice, but it's in a very still, small voice. Not booming like what we're learning here. Eliyahu was not just nobody. This is Eliyahu HaNavi. Okay, the great forerunner to the Yemot HaMashiach, the coming days of the Messiah, who reveals great mysteries and secrets to Chazal in the pages of the Talmud, and shows up to have a rendezvous with many other individuals of refined character. That he had to basically somehow tune in to the proper frequency to hear that small voice of Hashem. I mean, what does that say of someone of his caliber compared to us? The Rambam, in his Mishneh Torah, he explained the requirements to be a Navi, a prophet. Because, everybody and their mom wants to be a prophet, right? It's the greatest thing being a doctor or a lawyer. Want to be a prophet. The Rambam pointed out that according to the Torah, there are certain prerequisites that a person must meet in order to even become a Navi. And to qualify as a legitimate Navi, right? Not these dollar store Navis out here. The Navi needed to be in full control of himself, meaning he needed to master his traits. And we find this in the 7th chapter of Chilchot Yesodei HaTorah, the foundation of Torah. And this is what the Rambam says, Ve'ein ha'nevuah chala eli al chacham gadol b'chakama. Prophecy, let's say divine communication is another term I like to use, is bestowed upon every wise sage that is of a gibor b'midotav, strong character, strong midot, attributes. It says, who is never overcome by yitzro, his yetzahara, his natural inclination, in any regard. Instead, with his mind, he overcomes his yetzahara. It says, at all tamid, at all times. V'hu ba'al de'ah. Rechava nechona ad me'od. He must also possess a broad and correct mental outlook. This is powerful. When the Rambam mentioned that nevuah only rests upon a person who is a gibor b'midotav, a person with strong midot, it's a reference to a statement from Chazal in Masechet Shabbat, who taught that the Shekhinah, the divine presence of God, only rests upon a person who is strong, wealthy, wise, and of a prominent stature. We read here in Shabbat 92a. The Amar Mar, the master said, It says, Ein HaShechina, the Shechina only rests upon a person, Chacham, who's a Chacham, Gibor, who is mighty, Ve'ashir, who is wealthy, Uva'al Choma, and is of a great stature. Okay, there's a lot of different ways we can interpret that, but I'll explain this with God's help. Chacham, first off, a wise person. This is not referring to a philosopher, okay? Not there's anything wrong with philosophy per se. But wise refers to all the positive intellectual qualities a person has. When I say intellectual, I'm not talking about just academia, okay? I'm talking about a person in their mental faculties of being able to observe things in life with right-minded thinking, okay? Rational thinking. That a person is in control of themselves. They're not easily disturbed, they're not bipolar, they're not schizophrenic or anything of that nature, or they're not, filled with anxiety. This is a person whose their head is on their shoulders the right way. Wealthy, okay, as the Rambam mentioned, it refers to emotional qualities of a person who is happy with their lot in life. It doesn't refer to basically Warren Buffett, doesn't refer to Jeff Bezos or any other billionaire out there for that matter, because there's plenty of people with a lot of money who are not emotionally stable. So wealth here refers to one who is content with their lot in life. Because Chazal tell us that wealth is not measured by how much is in your bank account, but by how content you are with your lot in life. When one maintains good emotional stability, okay, when life has its ups and downs, this refers to wealth. You're emotionally in control of yourself. Now, when the sages also refer to here, the Shekhinah dwells upon a Uva'al Choma, a strong stature. Some people would translate a person who's tall, and some people might read the translation thinking tall. Like, what do I got to be, like an NBA basketball player for the Shekhinah to dwell upon me? No. A strong stature refers to a person who is spiritually disciplined, who has control over their Yetzer Hara. I also seen other people interpret this passage via the Rambam about physical health, and that is something the Rambam also talks about as well, that you can abide by the laws of kashrut, but you can also be a very fat, Jew as well, which is not good health-wise, right? Obesity is not good. That's actually a sin. And so the Rambam also advocates living a healthy life. It doesn't mean you have to be Mr. Olympia, okay? But a person who's in good physique, it maintains youthfulness as well, all right? That your body is your temple. But here when we learn about a strong stature, this is referring to someone who is spiritually disciplined, right? They're not so easily persuaded by the desires of their ego or their Yetzer Hara. And so he goes on afterwards, Torah, and he says, Adam shehu mimula bechol hamidot ha'elu shalem begufo. A person who is full of these qualities and is physically sound, right? I mean, this is physically, obviously referring to what we just talked about in the physical frame that the soul dwells in the body, being emotionally stable, mentally stable, etc. They are now fit for divine communication. Therefore, when he enters the Pardes, which is the mystical orchard of experiencing God's presence, which is also a hermeneutical term for Pashat, Ramesh, Drosh, and Sod, 4 different hermeneutical levels of the Torah, and is drawn in to these great and sublime concepts. If he possesses a correct outlook and comprehend and grasp them, he will become holy, okay? He will be sanctified, set apart. Not like a recluse or a monk in the mountains, no. He will be unfazed by the temptations of this world. He will not give in to him, is what he's saying. He will advance and separate himself from the masses who proceed in the darkness of the time, meaning he's not enticed by those things that the masses follow. He must continue and diligently train himself not to have any thoughts whatsoever about fruitless things or vanities and intrigues of the times, right? That's something that happens with our current day and age, with all of the shtuyot, the mishingas that people are falling victim to, especially with the uncertainty of the economy. They have a term FOMO, right? Fear of missing out. I got to get this crypto stock, I got to get this house, and they're finding out that they're getting screwed, right? So what happens is that people are getting distracted, And the Rambam says here a person must build the fortitude, mental, spiritual, emotional, physical fortitude, not to go the way of the masses, in order that they will be a vessel fit for divine communication. And he goes on to say afterwards that instead, a person's mind should constantly be directly upward. Upward. Penuya tami lemala kishura tachat hakise lahavin. Beneath God's throne, the kise hakavod, striving to comprehend the holy and pure forms and gazing at the wisdom of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed be He, in its entirety, and in its manifold manifestations from the most elevated spiritual form until the navel of the earth. What he's saying here is that a person should have perception. It's called sechel in Hebrew. Perception of everything that's happening in this world, because they are locked into a frequency. Their mind is locked into a frequency from what's happening in the intangible, nebulous worlds all the way down here. They can see everything that's happening. They understand how the dominoes are connected, the dots are connected. They see it all, they perceive it all, and therefore there's no worry. Ein omelvado. They see everything, the big picture. Why? Because they're constantly connected to what's above. And it says, appreciating God's greatness from them. And then it says, once a person is at this level, it says these preparations, it says here, the spiritual holiness will then rest upon him. Ruach HaKodesh shora alav. Spirit of holiness will rest upon him. Meaning, this is referring to divine communication. Then he goes on to say afterwards, Uv'eit shetanuach alav haruach. When the Spirit rests upon him, his soul becomes intermingled b'ma'alat ha'malachim ha'nikarim ishim. In the higher worlds above, with these messengers, these angels that we call ishim. Now obviously man's called ish, but ishim, angels are also angelic beings of fiery substance in the ether. And Aish, that's the two-letter root of Aleph Shin. Meaning that his soul is operating at a higher level where the angels are at. This is a transformation. Then it says, once this happens, he will be transformed into a completely different person. And not only that, he will understand with a knowledge. This is not academic knowledge, an intimate knowledge. A knowledge that is different from what it was previously. This is powerful. Because since the attainment of nevuah, of discerning God's voice, is a result of a process of internal refinement. Not sitting around on one's blessed tuchus, hoping that the creator of the universe would somehow send a prophet to them or somehow show them something or speak in the burning bush, right? No, it's a process of internal refinement. It's not a miracle, people. You got your head in your tuchus if you think that God's just going to speak out of nowhere and split the sky open for you. It is through a process of discipline. This is how a person attains these levels. The way in which the Rambam says his whole perception of reality changes. That's why if a person doesn't spiritually grow and they're at the same place they were 5 years or 10 years ago, it's a very, very dangerous place they're in. The Rambam taught that depending on the prophet's midot, their attributes, their character traits, would determine how much information God either reveals or conceals from them. So what that means is depending on how much of their life they committed to Hashem would determine how well they heard the voice of God. Now, we just read the Mishnah. Yom vayom, every single day, bachol, a heavenly voice, the voice of God goes throughout the world. But we don't hear it. Even Eliyahu had to tuck his head in between his thighs, bowing before Hashem to hear a still small voice that resonates through creation. And yet the Rambam says that if you and I would refine ourselves outside of all the distractions of the world, that we, our consciousness, the level of the soul, can vibrate at a higher level in which it becomes intermingled with the Ishim, the higher energetic beings, that puts us at a level with Hashem. And what do you read in the Tanakh, in the Nach, the Nevi'im? You read the different prophets. We have major and minor, right? And all the Navi'im, by the way, at least the major prophets, they're all Kohanim, they're priests. It's not like they were just nomadic Israelites. Yehezqel, Ben Buzi, Yirmiyahu, Yeshayahu, they're priests. They were already privy to much of the secrets of the Torah by their association with the Beit HaMikdash. Yet Yehezqel did not receive a single word from Hashem until after 5 years of being in Galut in Bavel. 5 years. And some people wake up and they have a trauma or a challenge with the economy or something and they think God's going to speak to them tomorrow. Come on, wake up. And what's this say about Yehezqel ben Buzi, a righteous Kohen from our perspective, but was schlepped away because of the sins of the people, and yet he was not privy to hear God's voice until 5 years later. Yirmiyahu, as a young, child or teenager per se, went through the onslaught of what Nebuchadnezzar did to the Jewish people. Instead of being schlepped off, he was released and witnessed the whole assassination, of what happened with Gedaliah, with why we observe the fast of Gedaliah after Yom Kippur. He witnessed all that and then wrote Sefer Echa, Lamentations, right? He heard God's voice, but through that. So it's the same thing with us. You want to be able to perceive Hashem, be able to discern Hashem speaking to you, however that may be. I don't know. He can speak to you through, I don't know, man, to go on the walk at the beach and you see sharks jumping out of the water. It can have a meaning to you. I got no clue. It's subjective. But for you to be able to discern that, it all depends on your refinement, your ability to go spiritually ghost for a while, away from the noise of the world, to go into seclusion with Hashem. When it comes to Moshe Rabbeinu, the Torah tells us that God would speak to him, Vayiqra HaShem. But before God spoke, there was a Vayiqra. There had to be a calling that took place. And a lot of people want God to speak to them, but they're not even called yet by Hashem. So how can you expect God to speak to you if you haven't even properly been called? And a lot of what you think is God calling and God speaking is noises and convoluted distractions that come from your ego or from the world. And so with that said, that's going to bring us to an end of this teaching for Parashat Vayiqra. I hope that this has brought a challenge to you, especially as every day that goes by, there's not a challenge in this world that is not challenging to somebody, right? Whether it's in North America, South America, Europe, Asia, wherever, somebody's always going through something. And the key here is to be able to discern the voice of the Creator, learning to listen, discerning what we're in, right? And that means to be able to listen, we have to refine our own character. The more we refine ourselves, the more we are committed. As the Rambam says, we elevate to a level in which we're able to communicate from Hashem. If Eliyahu had to stick his head, and this is Eliyahu, the guy who challenged false prophets of Baal, other Jews, to a showdown, and fire came down. He had to refine himself to such a degree that he's prostrating himself on the ground to hear the still small voice of God. What's to say about some of us then in difficult times? So whatever you have to do to remove the distractions, social media, video game consoles, whatever, remove it. That way you can better strengthen yourself. So with that said, Chavarim, that's going to bring us to a close for our teaching on Parashat Vayiqra. As I mentioned before, B'ezras Hashem, with God's help, I'll look into also bringing another teaching dealing with more of the korbanot, aspect of this week's Torah portion. And once again, if our organization is a blessing to you and you would like to donate, you can find the links to donate directly below the description of this video. We thank you in advance for your financial support. And if you have any questions pertaining to the teaching of this Torah portion, please feel free to send me an email. I won't answer those in the order that they come in. Until next time, Chavarim, may the God of Avraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov bless you and your family. Shalom and Kol Tov.